Good morning, Chairman. We're now live.
Good morning, everyone. I think we've reached the 10 o'clock starting mark, so good morning to everyone. Lovely to see you all this morning. And I'd like to welcome our colleagues from KPMG with us today as well. So I think when we start the proceedings, I think our Chief Executive has to leave our company at about 11 due to other commitments. So if we could bear that in mind when we're asking Debbie the questions, please. Thank you. So we will start, if we may, with apologies for absence. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman. We have apologies from Councillor Bunny, and from the officer side we have Heather Sandy, Executive Director of Children's Services, and Tom Baker, Chief Information Officer.
Thank you. And declarations of interest, members at item 2. Do we have any? No, thank you. So we'll move on to the minutes of our Audit Committee meeting held on the 11th of November 2024. Could I have a proposer and seconder for those, please? All those in favour? Thank you. Thank you. It's carried. And then at item 4, we'll move to the combined risk report, which is our annual risk report and a chance to get the views and assurances of our directors and senior executives about the state of play of our risks looking forward to the next year and beyond. So on that point, I'll just pass over to Claire, and then I'm sure Debbie will then proceed. Thank you.
Good morning. Just before Christmas, we undertook a series of interviews to establish the risk profile for Lincolnshire County Council, giving us the findings that are in this report. And shortly I will hand over to Debbie and the other exec directors to talk through their risk profile for their areas of responsibility. Overall, you'll see that the corporate assurance level is remaining as substantial, with the directorates all at adequate except for children's services, which is maintained at substantial. The key themes for this year's risk areas have slightly changed, but the main overarching common one for all directorates was not surprisingly related to budget and funding. So I'll pass over to Debbie to start the individual updates. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. So it's a real pleasure to be here to present the annual risk governance report. I'm going to start off just by highlighting the sort of corporate risk from a chief exec perspective, and then I'll pause and answer any questions, and then if it's okay for the committee then to go through the children's section, because as we've heard, Heather's had to give her apologies because we've got a special educational needs inspection with Ofsted landed on us this morning. So a bit of a busy morning for her. So as Mandy said, really pleased to report that the assurance level remained the same as last year, as in substantial. I think we've been through a very rigorous process working with our senior leaders and our senior managers, and I'm confident that we've got a consistent and reliable system of risk and controls across the whole of the organisation. Risk management is well embedded, and again I think that the emergence of this particular framework staff are getting much more confident with, so I think every year there's a better quality and more consistency in terms of the judgments that are made across each of the individual executive directors, the chief fire officer and their senior leadership teams. From a corporate perspective, the risks have changed, as Mandy said, from 2024, but not significantly. I'm pleased to report that the pressure and demands that we were having on recruitment and retention have calmed, they have settled. There are some clearly some hard to recruit areas across the council, but by and large we are been fairly successful with our recruitment and even more successful with retention of staff as well. The pressure on budget and funding remains, and obviously we had the autumn statement, we had the settlement just before Christmas, and we're expecting the final settlement today, which will give us a one-year budget. But all of the indications, I think, are fairly disappointing, particularly for rural areas, and we've obviously seen a cut to the Rural Services Grant, with funding going into what's been called a recovery grant, and areas of significant sort of urban deprivation have benefited from that, whereas clearly we haven't benefited and we lost from the Rural Services Grant. We're also seeing as other grants sort of trickle in that there is a slight shift to the formula, which again looks as though it is disadvantaging rural areas as well. But it's early days, and we'll see clearly what the settlement says today, and then also what the consultation for the next 2 years say. After saying that, we have got reserves, and clearly we will be, as managers and senior leaders, looking at various different options to put towards the new council once we get a new council in May. Legislative uncertainty, obviously new government focusing on some areas. Disappointed that the adult social care reforms have been clearly sort of extended, with a commission been established first, and that's an area that we think is in need of reform, but clearly there will be some delay to that reform. But we are expecting significant reform around special educational needs and also in terms of placements for children's social care. I'm pleased to report that Heather has been appointed to sit on the national working group around the special educational needs reforms, which means that we've got a real loud voice into government about what those reforms that are desperately needed would be. And then the other area of legislative uncertainty is clearly in the waste area, where there is a lot of significant change in terms of waste, which will be again governed through legislation, and we're just working out what that potentially means for us. Demand on those demand-led pressures services can continue, particularly with regard to working age adults increase. And this is an area in adult social care that is increasing nationally. So we are seeing more people of working age needing social care support, either through learning disability and particularly through mental health. And that is putting a significant pressure on our budgets, but we're doing some significant work to look at what alternative accommodation options there are to enable people to be independent for longer and to be able to better support people in the community rather than costly residential provision. And similarly, the special educational needs and alternative provision increases. Post the national reforms, there has been significant demand around special educational needs places. Again, colleagues will know that we invested over £100 million in our special school estate. So certainly the significant increase or overspend in the special educational needs budget that they've seen across the country, we have been a bit shielded from that, fortunately, but there is a significant pressure now on the higher needs budget, and we're looking at mitigating some of that risk by building specialist inclusion units within mainstream schools, and that's a paper that recently went through our Children's Scrutiny Committee. And then finally, a lot of discussion around the impact of the devolution white paper. Obviously, we've got our devolution deal, went through the Commons, went through Parliament, so we're expecting our first meeting, the inaugural meeting, to be held on the 6th of March. So looking forward to that, and then clearly the mayoral elections in May. The devolution white paper, though, does highlight local government reorganisation. And areas of two-tier councils were written to by the government to ask them to submit proposals around, or be prepared to submit proposals for local government reorganisation. So clearly that is an issue that we're going to need to work in collaboration with our other 9 councils across the greater Lincolnshire geography on, but waiting for a letter around what the criteria of that is likely to be. So 2025 started busy and confident that I think it will continue to be incredibly busy, but do believe that we've got the risks, controls and the capacity in place to rise to some of those challenges. So I'll pause at that point and then go on to the children's after any questions.
Thank you very much, Debbie. That's very informative. Mark, would you like to go first?
I'll start. I've got two questions. One of which is, it's all to do with uncertainties. Well, that's where risk comes from to a great extent anyway. So that the two uncertainties that seem to worry me most as well, as probably yourself, is IT, which is always going to be a worry to a great extent. Now that's dropped off our radar to an extent as being a key risk that's identified for 2025. And there may well be good grounds for actually trying to embed that at directorate level to ensure that they recognise what the risks are associated with their own deliveries. But I do worry that in these days of global uncertainty, almost in terms of what's happening, both in terms of conflicts and in terms of leaders of the Free West going off, doing their own thing, that IT becomes more and more important as a risk, as more and more people react to the situations that we've got globally, which is conflict and trade wars and God knows what else. Because I do think that global warfare is going to be completely different to what it's been in the past, with IT being a significant weapon to be used. So that's one thing. Are we sure that we're still keeping our eyes on that and if we're not going to lose it? And the second thing is, to a certain extent, to do with similar sort of things, that whilst we can understand what the risks are at the moment, are we sure that we have the ability to actually react to changes that might be taking place as a similar sort of consequences with regard to budgets and all the rest of it? So it's the uncertainties of the uncertainty that worries me. We can do what we can, when we identify them at the moment, but they may change quite significantly and quite quickly. And have we got the ability built into our systems to actually react quickly and change things?
Great, thank you very much. So IT, and particularly the risk around cyber security, is an important issue for us and continues to be an important issue. We've recruited some significant changes of leadership into our IT service, and I think we've made some outstanding appointments. We've stepped up a huge project, which again we were fortunate from the executive to be able to secure additional investment for, with a whole programme of activity around enhancing our cyber security. But I'll hand over to Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. Yeah, so this will probably wipe out about half of my presentation. So just to manage expectations of the committee when I get to resources, because I was planning to talk about this. So yeah, so as Debbie says, we've a massive change of leadership over the last 12 months from about last April time. So the complete, for want of a better word, clear out, complete replacement with new and, as Debbie says, highly skilled external appointments brought in. They've made a massive impact in that time, and Debbie referred then to the BOOL programme, which is the overarching programme, that name for the programme which we're using to essentially fix all of the basics and everything else within IT. So that covers infrastructure, it covers the way that we work, the way that we use IT in the council, particularly through the Microsoft 365 suite, but also things around the cyber security front as well. And there's a lot of investment, over £1 million gone into that area over the last year through procuring things like security operations centres and other assorted measures that we've been working with the existing incumbent provider Circa with. The big major piece of work that we're ongoing with at the moment is going through a negotiation process now with the final 4 bidders for the new contract, which will come in from next April. And that's going to be a bit of a game-changing contract for the council. It'll be completely different to the contract that we've got with Circo at the moment, a lot more focused on future development, using things called, the term's evergreen, so not allowing things to go out into obsolescence and what have you. There's a rolling programme of replacements for all of our kit that we use. So I'm confident that as I say, with as Debbie said, with the backing of the executive and the wider council in terms of investment, that the IT estate is in a lot better place than it has ever been and will be ever, and that ongoing investment as well will ensure that we'll continue to be on the front foot also. That's the first bit for IT, I think. Is that okay?
And then with regard to the unknown unknowns, I mean, again, I think we've got a track record of being able to be fleet of foot and to be able to respond. Clearly, COVID challenged us, and I think that we met that challenge really well. We've got a stable management team. We've got some really good staff. We do a lot of work working with the national sector, and Lincolnshire, again, in terms of through its senior officers, have got a lot of experience of working on that national stage and been able to influence national policy, and so that you are, I think, with having that voice around the table with government, you're much better to be able to horizon scan because you're nearer to the action in terms of what's happening. So I think our stability holds us in our favour. I think our capability holds us in our favour, and I think our relationship with government at a fairly strategic level and with our sort of sector representatives means that we're well placed for horizon scanning as well.
If I could just come back, Chairman. The concern was more to do with budgets, I suppose, which you've got at the top of the list to a great extent. Our expectation is that we perhaps won't do necessarily too well out of the current government because of its view of councils such as ours. So whilst we understand how to react to the current view of what budgets may well be and what support we might get from central government, my concern to a certain extent is that central government maybe doesn't know what it's doing in relation to actually managing the budget nationally. There may well be significant changes during the course of the year, you know, quick reactions to the global situation or the economic situation that applies to the UK, which might have additional issues for us in terms of not necessarily getting what we're expecting to get. So I know that we've got reserves, you know, that we can call upon, but you know, how long do those reserves last, and what might the consequence be? So it's a question of, you know, can we react? I mean, we probably can, but it's how, you know, it's how long we may be able to react for before we have to take difficult decisions ourselves.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's quite clear the government will expect, you know, local government to pick up a lot of the issues that are taking place nationally.
Yeah, it is disappointing. So Andrew will answer the technical bit of how long the reserves will last, if you like. But I suppose the luxury of those reserves do mean that we can plan and we can make changes to the shape and size of the organisation and the way the organisation does things in a planned way rather than in a sort of responsive way, which puts us, I think, in a really beneficial position compared to others. We've been here before and we've had to make some significant decisions, and we as officers are working up different options, but obviously wouldn't be taking any of that forward until we've got a new council in May in terms of political options. In terms of the technicality of how long the reserves would last, I'll ask Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. So obviously reserves are quite a point of debate, aren't they, I think, in terms of running a council, and you know, naturally it is seen by external forces sometimes as a bad thing. Clearly they are a good thing to have now in a circumstance where we're in a position of uncertainty. So we have the main reserve vehicle that we use to sort of manage uncertainty is the financial volatility reserve. That sits just under £50 million and has been at that level for a number of years now. We've been able and fortunate to be able to keep that at that level without having to use it. And the current budget that's currently going through the democratic process at the moment doesn't propose to use any of that. That's the first point, is that we've seen potential storms on the horizon and we're not going anywhere near that now. We've also been taking moves over the last few years to increase things like the council contingency. So that when I first started was about £3 million. That is proposed to be £8 million next year, and that's clearly there to help us manage those uncertainties. And that's the learning that we've had from the recent, it was the 2022 year, wasn't it, when the inflation increased after the Ukraine war and everything that came from that. But also as well, we've been proposals to move other money around as well to help us manage that situation. So we've been using service reserves to manage specific pressures where we've needed to, but also as well recommending in the current budget as well to increase the general reserve, which is the ultimate backstop, by a further £3 or £4 million as well. So that's all in the context of that uncertainty. Debbie talked about the contingency planning, and that's the other really important bit, really. So we've always had a contingency plan for circumstances. When we were going through COVID, for example, there was quite uncertain times around the funding that we might have received then. So there's always something on the shelf for a particular rainy day that might be required, for example. I think the additional issue that we've been grappling with, particularly over the last 12 months, and particularly since we've seen that improvement in the internal IT provision, is around what we can do around automation as well. And that was, again, another point that I was going to reflect on in my area, particularly for resources anyway, because it's quite an administrative heavy function. It's where we can, I guess, as people retire, for example, whether we can replace manual tasks with use of things like Copilot and other functionality that's part of the Office 365 estate, which we invest heavily in anyway. And at the time that we're about to go into a new contract with an expert service provider, the timing's aligning in that as well. But there's enough in there that, as the Section 151 officer, I'm confident about the ongoing stability in the position of the council. And I'll be saying that in my Section 25 statement to council in February, but we need to be ready for what comes out. And it's particularly the key point is what comes out of the spending review late spring and the ensuing fair funding review that the government have committed to doing. So that's the key inflection point, really.
Thank you, Andrew. Paul, and then Andrew Middleton, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I've always been a fan of positive futures and stuff, trying to work and improve situations for young people. I'm mentioned about specialist unit in our mainstream school. Just occurs to me that most of our mainstream schools are now actually academies, and that will bring challenges. I just wondered if you could explain how that's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the positive feedback around positive futures. They work incredibly well, and I have to say highly effective, and some really good staff in there are really passionate about what they do. So we wrote out to our academy mainstream schools and said we'd like you to come forward in terms of opening up to have a specialist unit, so that for that geography that you would be able to provide a bit of a bridge between mainstream and specialist, so to have a bit of an option in between. I think, to be fair, from an education point of view, we have a really good relationship with our head teachers, whether they're of mainstream schools or maintained schools, or whether they are within academies. 14 of them came forward and said we'd really like to work in partnership with you. And so, as I said, that paper went to scrutiny. So we will just behave towards them as if they are a maintained school, and we will fund them at that rate. And, I think we do have a really good relationship. Lincolnshire children go to academies and maintain schools. And so the more that I think that we just behave, there are children across Lincolnshire, it's really important that we work together. But certainly the feedback from the head teachers has been incredibly positive about it.
Thank you, Chair. Couple of queries on the report, the combined report. But I start by saying that what you said, Debbie, about the strength of the management and leadership team, the robustness and the longevity of it, and Andrew about the reserves, it's a lovely position to be in, and there's a few authorities would love to have even half your strength in both finance and leadership. But when I first saw the substantial assurance, this is the Ofsted inspector in me, I then looked at the components that led up to that, and I saw there were 4 adequates and 1 substantial, and even the substantial one on page 23, it's got some pretty high risk areas there that could knock it into acceptable. How did that substantial grade emanate from 4 adequates and 1 substantial? And second point is, I'm not sure who constructs these grades and what review is it, and how is internal audit involved in coming to those grade decisions?
Great, thank you. I suppose the first comment that I would make is that the judgments are subjective. That there's criteria, but without a doubt they are subjective. And unlike Ofsted, it's not measuring, if you like, the quality of practice or the quality of the services. It's measuring how tight I think, and our managers think, our controls are to manage the risks. And so whilst, particularly as you highlighted in children's, those risks are known, which I suppose is the first thing, and we're taking active action to try and mitigate those risks. So I think my view on the judgment around substantial, and it is a subjective judgment, is that I'm confident that we know what the risks are and we're taking measures, and the council has always supported officers in investing in preventative actions and upstream actions to mitigate those risks. So I think the £100 million investment in special schools is an example. I think the investment into our mainstream units is another example. Investment into our homes is another example. Within adults, we've got a lot of extra care provision, which demonstrates that the council's got a track record of investing in what's needed to be those preventative measures. It is subjective. The process, and Mandy, I'm sure will want to come in, the process is that there's a support and challenge session with Audit, individually with the exec directors, individually with me. But you're absolutely right, it is subjective at the end of the day, but my judgment is we know what the risks are, we're investing in preventative action to mitigate those risks, and I'm confident that we are mitigating the risks. But Mandy may want to come in.
Just to confirm, really, as Debbie was saying, we run those interviews with the exec directors and chief fire officer and Debbie, and we provide a challenge if we don't think, if we're of a differing view around that approach. Obviously, the assurance statements have been aligned to what internal audit use against their audit reports, so we feel like we're getting a more consistent approach as to how we assess those assurance levels.
So, Chair, if I might summarise my perception of that, is you're assessing the rigour, the robustness and the capacity and capability of the leadership at all levels to cope with anything that comes your way, and with a financial reserve to put behind it to make those investments to ensure you do handle risk effectively, not grading the outcome of the service necessarily. That's a separate exercise. Okay, thank you, Chair. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One of our newest risks is AI, which you've mentioned in here. But you also say that you're using it day to day at the moment, and obviously it'll get more and more and more. But you say that it could open up the council to currently unknown repercussions, not least in data protection area and potential reputational damage. So are we thrashing ahead with AI, or are we using it cautiously to make sure we don't drop into these mud holes and create problems for us? So if you could just explain, you know, the way, because we're going to need good officers and good consultants on all this, I imagine. So it just put my mind at rest for the future on how that's all going to go, please.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, my brief summary, and then I'll hand over to Andrew, is cautious, very, very cautious. And I've got policy in place. The service area is working really tightly with IT, but absolutely taking a cautious approach.
Yeah, just to pick up on Debbie's point, really, I think it's we're looking at it where it's, you know, deemed to be safe to do so. The whole premise of AI, it needs good data to be able to work effectively, or you get random results, as you sort of suggest, Councillor Coupland. So one of the streams within the Bull programme is creating essentially a data platform, essentially that is well managed within an inch of its life, essentially. So what goes in and what is kept in there is appropriate and reflects reality, I guess, and that's an ongoing programme at the moment. So the areas that we're actually looking to deploy automation on at the moment are, you know, I'll give a simple example of one that we're looking at in resources at the moment. As an example being, we, you know, have an HR team that gets a lot of basic queries around what do I do if this happens or somebody goes off sick, and that involves a manager having to call a member of the business support team that's then just reading generally off an FAQ script, you can quite easily use Copilot with the policy in the background that would tell the individual who needs the query what to do, basically, therefore taking out that individual and that overhead. So that's a safe example, but that even there, that needs the policy and what's written down to be absolutely crystal clear and not open to interpretation. So that's a lot of the work that we'll have to do around, tidying up documents and policies and what have you to essentially make it happen. I think things where you wouldn't want it to go towards is making decisions, for example, on child protection cases, for example, and things like that. And we wouldn't be suggesting to do that because that's what we have trained professionals to do. It's around low-level administrative tasks, and that's where the low-hanging fruit will be in the first instance. But as Debbie said, very, very cautious. There's a bit prodding around to try and work out how best to do it in a safe sort of way, I'd say, for now.
Thank you. If I can follow on, because I know a number of people would like to replace me with DeepSeek, but it's not going to happen. There's two observations, if I may. Number one is continuing with that. We use or developing more AI in my day job. And as much as there is around the what can you use AI for, there is the preparation of the people to be using AI from the customer end of the experience as well. And I think what you've described today, Debbie, in a lot of the areas, there is a lot of transformation that's going to continue as we expect. Not to underestimate the risk of that from a customer experience, not necessarily our members of, people in Lincolnshire itself, but our colleagues. Andrew, you just talked about them getting used to the experience of doing so and trying to wean people off. And we buy a lot of small businesses, and trying to wean people off that direct customer experience is quite difficult. And a lot of these transformations we're talking about, a lot of the challenges and the risks in here, to get the budget, to maintain it, etc., is going to require a customer change as well. So not to underestimate that risk. The second thing, and I've already spoken to Kevin and Mandy about this, is actually from a report from us as a consumer point, it's quite hard to read from 23 to 24 to 25 because the titles change. And I think it's an opportunity for next year is to tell that 2-year story. When we do it as a spot valuation like this, it's quite difficult. To have the trend, the story a little bit more might be more helpful both for us as a committee, but also for the people who are feeding into this, to notice that change of direction. Death by 1,000 cuts, rapid change, some of the councillors have mentioned it. So again, it's just my observation, it might make it easier for all the way down to understand that risk. When all of a sudden you add 3 small minor adjustments together, you get a big one, what the direction of travel is. So that would be just more of an observation to help us to get a sense from the storytelling, if that's okay.
I think that's really helpful. I mean, in terms of your first comment, absolutely, that is a risk in terms of customers. I think one of the really the thing that I find in terms of working with elected members is because elected members are the voice of the community, that they tell you what people are saying and what the customer experience is. So I think that that's really valuable and really rich in terms of understanding that. And the point around the transition, I think that's a really good point. So we'll take that away.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Debbie, for that very detailed analysis of where we are at the moment, and also covering children's services for Heather as well. In terms of, I was noting on Heather's part of the paper, which is the unregulated and unregistered placements for children. Could you just give a very brief description of how that would actually arise in terms of the assurance that the committee can seek from that? Because obviously we're not all involved in children's services.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So from a children's perspective, obviously the risks that are identified within here, predominantly around when we talk about the higher needs block, that's around the special educational needs. And again, I think we've spoken around the increased demand and then what we're doing about that. The other area that's having significant pressure is children's social care market. Ideally, when children need to be cared for by the local authority, you want to place them with family and friends as much as possible, and we would do that through what's called kinship arrangements. If we can't find a safe placement across family and friends, the next option then would be to look at a fostering option. And again, we have an army of foster carers who do an absolutely fantastic job. And then if the child's or the young person's emotional well-being or their behaviour is such that foster carers can't manage those behaviours, then we would put them into a residential home. We've got quite a large sort of suite of premises that we can utilise, but they are normally working at full occupancy. And then we also utilise the market to go out for private placements when we need to put a child into a placement or a children's home and we haven't got a place ourselves. The national market position in relation to placements are such that they are sometimes like gold dust to try and get a place for a child. There is a real lack in the market, and the amounts that the private sector charge for them are considerable. Placements come at considerable cost. Now, all placements should be regulated by Ofsted. And occasionally, we don't like to do it, but occasionally, if we need to find a placement for a young person on a Friday night and we can't find a placement, we can't find any registered provision that are registered with Ofsted to offer a placement, we may have to use what's called an unregulated placement. So that's a placement that isn't regulated by Ofsted. Clearly, we don't like to do it. There is an escalation process, so that decision can only be made by the Director of Children's Services or one of the assistant directors. They have to notify me, we have to notify Ofsted, so we have got an alert so that we can continually track that young person to place them into a registered provision as soon as we possibly can. But because there is a national shortage, unfortunately all local authorities are driven to at times utilise an unregulated placement. Not something we want to do, but something that we occasionally need to do. From a risk control point of view, as I say, we do have a mechanism in place of escalation so that we are aware of that. We also make sure that we've got adequate staff to be able to wrap around that young person as well. And then we're obviously investing in our own provision and growing our own provision, but it's just a challenge to grow your own provision to keep hold of demands because of the numbers of children in need of coming into the care of the local authority are increasing. I think the other thing that I would say, and again this is a national issue, we've seen a considerable reduction in mental health tier 4, so inpatient mental health beds. And we've seen a huge increase in the number of young people with significantly challenging behaviour that have needed to come into the care of the local authority because their parents are no longer able to provide that support for them. I don't think that's a coincidence that we've seen a lack of mental health beds and then pressure in terms of the social care system. I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing. I'm not saying that it's better. You know, it is better for young people to be placed into a community provision rather than into a mental health institution. But we haven't seen a flow of the funding from mental health services into councils. And so, again, I think that is an area that we are putting pressure on the government around the reforms as well. And the government has got a whole host of reforms around trying to put some more regulation into that market because, again, some of the profits that are made are eye-watering. But clearly the government need to make sure that they don't take such action as to drive people out and then we have even less placements, which could be an unintended consequence unless they manage the shift and the regulation appropriately. So it is a bit of a complex issue.
Thank you, Deborah. No, Andrew just wants to come. Just one more question for me, if that's okay. So this is also restricting the market demand and supply issues. Are they putting pressure on us secure placements as well?
Yes, so again, I think as we've seen more and more young people with significantly challenging behaviour and behaviour which places themselves at significant risk, or that they are at risk of others in the community as opposed to within the home, we are seeing a a pressure on our secure estate. Now, Lincolnshire have got a secure unit. Although the council run it, it's not a council resource, if you like. It's a national resource, and we then would utilise a bed if there was one available. And that's for young people who are serving sentences. So from a criminal justice perspective, need to have a secure placement, and also from a welfare secure, because their behaviours are placing them at risk as well. So that's both of them. We are seeing an increase nationally. Again, really difficult to get a placement into secure. And again, colleagues may know that we have been asked to build a brand new secure unit with sort of like about double the level of beds and provision within there. And we've got a grant from government, and we are working on rebuilding and enhancing our secure estate as well. But fortunate that we've got that provision in Lincolnshire for the occasional times when we do need it.
Yes, sadly, I know quite a lot about this field because I chair the Complex Cases Governance Committee in Derbyshire, and everything Debbie said is right. £10,000 a week is not abnormal in the private sector, and we have no alternative because there's no provision. So I'm pleased you're investing in your own capacity, but my question is, this is a slam dunk for integrated care system and collaboration with the health service. And particularly, I find myself in Derbyshire every Monday afternoon saying, where's the step up from Derbyshire Partnership Trust to help us out on this? Where's the step up from Lincolnshire Partnership Trust? And is that a fruitful area of pushing harder?
Again, quite fortunate in Lincolnshire because we commission through a Section 75 child and adolescent mental health services. So we're in a bit of a stronger position than some of our other local authorities because we're the commissioner of those mental health services for children and young people. To be fair, particularly in relation to our own estate, they have stepped up, and we do have wraparound psychology for our young people who are based within our homes in Lincolnshire, and that's a really important offer in terms of direct intervention around mental health services for our most vulnerable young people, but also to train up our staff. What we do know, though, is the continuing healthcare, and Martin will probably talk about the continuing healthcare budget, which is the budget that health do the assessment to decide whether or not they should contribute to complex care packages. We are seeing ICBs under huge pressure to reduce their costs through continuing healthcare budgets as opposed to increase their cost. And again, I think one of the things, and I would say this as a former director of children's services, is that a lot of the health conversations are obsessed or focused on ambulance waiting times, A&E, and children very rarely get a voice. And I think it's a national issue that, again, we need to be better nationally at putting pressure on so that there are more targets around young people, because at the moment the conversation's consumed with A&E waiting times, as I'm sure it is in Derbyshire.
There we go. Debbie, thank you for that. The question resides for me around the paragraph we got on there for market supply. My team know at work I'd never let them get away with writing such a vague paragraph, by the way. Nice try. What I would say is just taking everything you've said on there, we are spending a lot of revenue spend effectively over because of the profit margins in the private sector. So my question is there an opportunity to bite the bullet and feel the dreams territory, build it and they will come, where we actually get to try and use some of we know we're going to spend it on the private, use that money to create. We've seen it, so our disclosure, our Lincolnshire Co-op, we did a lot of this with the pharmacists, just trying to actually put them through the pharmacy training, etc., knowing that that's a supply, 50% might go somewhere else, etc. We know it's going to not necessarily be retained within there, but actually it's an opportunity for us to do this. I'm also thinking about whether it's a premises issue, as in availability. Again, Lincolnshire Co-op, one of the things we're looking for is social housing. There are other partners and other availability out there to get on the front foot. So it's not looking for an answer now, But I think that bit of being innovative, we've talked about we need to be ahead of the curve and to do things differently. I think for me personally is looking at preventing that risk occurring by doing something completely different, not waiting for the national. Yes, it'd be great to get the funding, but we might just need to different conversation. I appreciate we're going to wait for the council. There's an opportunity. It will be an interesting option for me.
Absolutely, and over the last year we've invested in 3 more homes. Clearly we need to do more, but we have invested in 3. And it's also difficult to recruit residential staff as well, so it's that challenge that if you grow it too big and then you can't recruit and you can't train people neither. But notwithstanding that, we do want to do more. I think we used to be fairly flexible around supported accommodation, particularly for 16, 17-year-olds, but then Ofsted regulate it, and therefore all that sort of flexibility that probably you used to have, you can't do anymore. So as an example of that, we used to utilise a couple of bed and breakfast accommodations, because those bed and breakfast accommodations, the people who ran them were really good with our young people. They were absolutely fantastic with our young people and provided, meals for them, helped them to be independent, were really nurturing. Understandably, Ofsted said you can't use bed and breakfast because I would completely agree. Most bed and breakfast are not acceptable. So that meant we couldn't use it, but actually occasionally that flexibility works. So some of that's been taken away. But notwithstanding that, I do think that there is more that should be done. Government are, though, as well, looking at putting some, not price caps, but putting some regulation into the market. Now, it's at the early stages of what that looks like, but they are looking at putting some regulation in. They are also going to put regulation into the fostering not the fostering agencies, the social work agency, which means that you must be qualified 3 years before you can join an agency. For the first 3 years, you must work for a local authority. So some of those regulations, I think, will help. But we'll need to see. They're putting more regulation into the legislation than they actually need. So they are putting provision for price capping, but they don't want to use that, but they will if they have to. So again, I think we need to see both tracks, innovation here and see what the national impact is as well.
Thank you, Ian. Just one final question from your last point, Debbie. Looking at the sort of market supply on staff shortages in the social care sector, because as vis-a-vis your previous comment, does that generate any safeguarding issues from us in terms of getting the right people for the recruitment into social care? Because obviously that's very important when you're dealing with vulnerable adults, vulnerable children.
So social care appointment and residential and early help, as we call it, are laden with various different legislative requirements in order to recruit. So the recruitment process is incredibly robust. We've been fortunate in terms of social workers. We're doing more apprenticeships as well, so growing our own. And what we find, the more people that we grow our own from Lincolnshire stay in Lincolnshire and stay with us, the retention is better. So we are doing a lot of work in terms of apprenticeships within social care. We tend to recruit very well around early help, which is the bit before you need statutory intervention, so the preventative bit of the support. Residential is a challenge, but we're doing more work around how we can get our pipeline of early help workers to go into residential first before they go into, so looking at different pathways in, and also looking at apprenticeships as well. So the area at the moment that's a challenge for us is residential, but it does fluctuate.
Analysis of both the overall position of the authority and children's services as well. So any further questions for Debbie on these items? No, thank you. Thank you once again, and then I think you'll make your...
Great, thank you very much.
So if we could now pass on to Martin, please. Martin, thank you, on regarding adult social care.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just quickly run through the half-dozen risks that have been identified for adult care and community wellbeing. and try to, and there are lots of interconnections between the different risks, but I'll try not to repeat myself too much. So the first one is budget. This is fundamentally about the fee rates that we pay, and in that we pay for care for people across Lincolnshire. The vast majority of the Directorate's budget is spent on the provision of actual care for individual people. Something like £5 out of every 6 that the Directorate spends is on individual care packages. Fundamentally, because this is a people business, what we are very susceptible to is changes in the national living wage. So the national living wage has gone up by 6 or 7% every year for a number of years. I think that is absolutely justified in terms of the quality of the people that work in care. I mean, adult social care is a fundamentally people business. We need people who are able to do that work and to do it well, and who are able to care. But it does mean that gives us a constant, way above inflation pressure that is built into the budget. And therefore, although we have quite sophisticated models that work out what proportion of the cost of delivery is from workforce and what proportion of the cost of delivery is for non-pay issues, the net impact is that we are always facing pressures significantly above inflation. We are currently coming towards the end of our annual consultation process on fees. Our average offer, I mean, it varies across different sectors because of the different ratios between pay and non-pay, but our proposed offer this year averages at 5.7%, which is obviously very much higher than the inflation rate. So, you know, that's our fundamental pressure. Worth noting that explicitly excludes the employer's national insurance contribution changes, where we've been in a position where government nationally has made a policy decision. They have given public services additional funding to cover the cost of that for directly employed staff. But to give you a sense of how that works in adult social care, in my directorate I have about 800 staff employed by the council. There are in the region of 25,000 people working in adult social care across the county, people who are not employed by the council, and therefore the council was not given additional funding to mitigate the impact of national insurance contributions. We've done significant analysis with providers, and we've used some technical experts in the field to try to understand what the consequences of this are in the market. What has become clear is that it is very, very differential between different sorts of provider. Essentially, depending on the staffing structure, the way in which an organisation has set up its staffing will have a greater or lesser impact. It's therefore not consistent across the market. Therefore, we've taken the view that rather than building it into fee rates, we should seek a short-term mitigation approach, which we are currently working on. But that is a significant unfunded pressure within the budget. But that kind of issue of the national living wage increasing at a well above inflation rate causes an ongoing pressure in the budget. We're doing very much what we can to mitigate those broader costs. As say, national living wage, you know, it is the wage that has to be paid. We can't not pay that inflation. We have to take account of that. Care packages, people have a statutory entitlement to that care, but we are doing significant work to try to reduce the need that people have for care. So using greater use of technology and greater preventative activity to postpone or indeed avoid the need for care arising, and that's one of the key ways we can hold back the pressure on the budget. In the second area then, market supply. One of the consequences of us being very effective in our budget management and our fee management is that we pay some of the lowest fee rates in the country, and there are some areas where, in fact, some aspects of service where, in fact, Lincolnshire has, if not the lowest, we are second or third lowest in the country. That is positive for the county council. On the other hand, it does mean that we are often faced with providers who are finding it quite difficult to deliver a high quality service given the fee rates that we provide. And I think it is fair to say that there is a correlation between the level of fees that the County Council is able to afford and the fact that we have some of the lowest average CQC ratings in the country. So generally, providers are finding it quite difficult to deliver the services at the rates that the council is able to afford. So we are working very hard with our providers to have a really frank and open relationship with them, and I think it's a sign of the success of our relationship that we are able to have constant conversations with them and constructive conversations about what the County Council can do to minimise cost issues for providers, to improve their cash flow, to make their businesses more viable, without them defaulting. There are some parts of the country where judicial review is a regular feature of the relationship. We are some distance away from that, and I think it's a sign of the good relationship that we have. But we are having to work with providers to, in some cases, enable providers to leave the market in a managed manner, and in other areas to ensure that they have the support that they need to be able to meet the demands of Lincolnshire people. But it's a difficult area, and we are seeing a regular drumbeat of providers that are no longer able to provide the service and are having to leave the market at short notice, and that is never a good position for anyone. So we're working actively on that. The third area about demand and capacity. We do with a long-term ongoing issue for Lincolnshire is that we have a significantly older population than the average. We are, and that is steadily increasing further. And in particular, the over 85 population, a very, very high proportion of people over the age of 85 are in the care system. And what we are seeing is that the absolute number of people over the age of 85 is expected to increase very substantially over the next few years. That's actually not my main area of concern, because we know that and we can mitigate for that. What we're seeing more recently and more urgently is a very significant increase in demand from working age adults, so adults aged between 18 and 64. And really there are two main issues there. One is significant changes in the way that the NHS is operating. So a number of individuals who have very high levels of need, who previously would have frankly been in institutional care funded by the NHS, there's been a clear national view that that is not the most appropriate way for individuals to receive care, and that they should instead be living in the community. There is ample evidence that they can have a much better quality of life. But one of the consequences of that is that instead of being 100% NHS funded, they are jointly funded by the local authority and the NHS. And I think it's fair to say that the level of funding transfer from the NHS has not been the same as the level of cost that has been transferred from the NHS. The other side of things is that, again, partly because of success of our NHS colleagues, working age adults with lifelong disabilities are living much longer than they used to, and are living with much more severe disabilities than they used to. And sadly, one of the things that we find is that individuals with a learning disability are significantly more likely than the average population to suffer from mental health issues and to suffer from early stage dementia. So all of those mean that our working age population in the care system is growing at a rapid rate, and the complexity of their needs is growing at a very rapid rate as well. So we're particularly focused on that sector and looking at the areas that we can address to really enable people to have a really good quality of life in the community at the lowest cost that we can find. Reference to the NHS takes me into the fourth area, which is partnerships. It is very common when talking about health, social care, to then talk about health immediately afterwards, and in some respects almost to treat health and social care as if they're two sides of the same coin. To an extent that's true. We are very affected by changes in the NHS, both nationally and locally. So the NHS nationally is very much seeking to address urgent emergency care, waiting times. That generally means that they want people out of hospital and into social care much more quickly than might have been the case. Debbie also made reference to the position about continuing healthcare, where the NHS is trying to be much more rigorous than in the past and making sure that people who are claiming continuing healthcare, which is NHS care and therefore free at the point of delivery, really do meet the national criteria, and they are seeking to control that as a cost pressure. I think there is significant evidence that the NHS is sometimes somewhat over-eager in that area, and that we as the council are having to be really careful that they are indeed providing and assessing individuals as being eligible for continuing healthcare when they really are, and that they are correctly applying the national guidance on this. And there's some evidence to suggest that there are some issues here, as indeed there are nationally. But I think it's important to note that social care doesn't simply link with the NHS, and indeed only about 1 in 5 people who come into social care do so through the NHS. 80% of people come to us direct. And that often our biggest connection is with housing. And it's been rightly said that every care decision is in fact also a housing decision. And so our relationship with the district councils about housing and about the nature of housing and the quality of housing are absolutely central to adult social care. And they are a fundamental element of how we enable people to stay in the community and stay well. Moving on then, recruitment and retention. Good quality social workers are fundamental. And it's one of those areas where a good social worker will save their own salary multiple times every year, because if you've got someone who is less experienced, who is more risk averse, the chances are that they will default into saying people should go into residential care, should have a larger care package. It's hard to be criticised for giving someone more social care than less social care. But a really good social worker, and we have many really good social workers working in the directorate, a really good social worker can see how someone can have the best quality of life with the lowest level of adult social care. More adult social care is generally bad for you as opposed to being good for you. So recruitment of good social workers is critical. We are generally doing quite well in recruitment and retention. There are a number of areas where it's quite challenging to get staff, but we have a number of initiatives in place to resolve that. And then the final area, data intelligence. We produce a vast amount of data. There are thousands of people in the social care system. We have hundreds of contracts. We deliver, we commission, I think it's 4 million hours of home care every year. Huge amounts of data. We really need to be in a very good position to understand what that data is telling us. There have been some areas of development for that we've been working on, and we are getting better. But if we're not really clear about the use of the data, that would undermine our ability to deliver the service. So it's a probably less rapid run through than perhaps I was hoping, but hopefully that gives you a sense of the key areas.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Martin. It was just the right length, I think, and hit all the right topics. So thank you so much. I'm sure everyone's got lots of questions for you.
Starting with me, Martin. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very good, and I am comforted that you seem to have a grip of all the issues. However, there's always a however, isn't there? We had an item at health scrutiny about adult care, and it's quite clear that adult care is nationally, not particularly targeting Lincolnshire, is a bit of a mess as a whole, and is in a difficult position, I think, for many of the reasons that you've just talked about. And my concern is that whilst we look after a certain proportion of the people that require adult care, there's an awful lot of adult care that takes place in the community, which we nor the NHS really see an awful lot of it taking place. This is caring by family members, and so on. And for the very reasons that you've talked about, that's becoming more and more difficult as people grow older, because it means their carers are older and maybe will struggle, because they're in their 60s, looking after parents in their 80s and 90s, with all the difficulties that they've got, which become quite difficult for a family member to actually deal with. And of course, social workers, our social workers or our social suppliers, do have holidays and so on, which is not always the case when the family member is looking after an elderly relative. So there's all sorts of issues there. But in terms of being specific, because that's what I need to be in terms of your presentation, are care homes required to take our clients? Because it does strike me that if they are required to take our clients, and we put more and more of our clients into a care home for the obvious issues that you've talked about in relation to costs and charges, that at some stage that care home is going to become uneconomic because it can't cross-subsidise between the local authority clients and the private clients. And the private clients may well not be providing, the profitability that's actually required. And of course, at that stage, there could be quite a lot of local authority clients then to deal with if that care home stops, providing the care and has to say to us, has to say to you, we have to close, and will you please, find other places for your clients, as it would have to do to the private sector clients as well. So I just wondered whether, that to a certain extent, we are creating the sort of issues that make it difficult. But the key to it is, are they required to take our clients if they have vacancies, or are they required to find vacancies for our clients, or can they operate purely privately?
Inevitably the answer is it depends, but I'll expand on that. In general, no. Care homes are not required to take local authority funded individuals. They are private businesses, and they can choose whether to take people or not. And they are also able to cross-subsidise between local authority and private individuals. Essentially, they set the fee rate that they choose to charge, and they clearly, as the council, we set the rate that we would like and expect to pay, and we seek to negotiate with care homes on the basis that we would expect them to charge us that rate. And in general, with older people, we are able to place at the rate that we would expect to. I think it is the position that a significant number of care homes they'll take self-funders, and they will charge them a higher rate, and there is a degree of cross-subsidy. And there is also the position that quite a lot of care homes will say, well, we won't take the usual rate that the council is seeking to pay. We will charge more, and the council is under a legal obligation that if we need to offer someone a placement, which if the council is due to pay for that individual, because obviously social care is a means-tested service, but if the council is due to pay for that service, we have to offer a placement which there is no additional charge to the individual. And if that's at above the usual rate, then it's above the usual rate and the council needs to pay for it. But if we say there's this care home place which is at our usual rate, and there's that one which is £200 a week more, if the family want the more expensive one, then they can have the more expensive one, but they have to pay the difference. And so it is up to the care home to charge the rates. We're seeing a significant difference between the older people's market and the working age adults market. In the older people's market, we actually have an excess of supply. There are more care beds available in the county than there are people to fill them. We have quite a lot of empty beds in the county, and that gives us a significant benefit that therefore providers are quite keen to have local authority funded individuals, and we are therefore able to keep the fee rates quite low. That can have negative financial impacts on care homes and their ability to keep financially viable. But we work very closely with them on that. In the working age adult field, the vast majority of placements are made by the local authority and funded by the local authority. There are fewer placements available than there are people to be placed in them, and therefore we are increasingly finding that the fee rates we're having to pay are above the rates that we would wish to pay. But because we have a statutory duty to place, then ultimately we are required to pay those rates. But we work very, very closely with providers to really challenge the rates that they are charging, to say, well, actually justify that rate to us. And if you can't justify it, we will find somewhere else that it can sometimes be quite challenging.
So just to summarise what you were saying to me, I think, so I have a better understanding of the issue. In the pure elderly sector, it's the business can manage the numbers and where those numbers come from, and so it's up to them to actually get the numbers right and to work out the finances. And if they don't, if they don't do it, there should really be no reason, to a certain extent, that they do it. That they should get into difficulties because they have got that ability then to actually react to the marketplace and react to the numbers that they're taking in.
I mean, so in principle, you're right. The challenge is because there are more older people's care home beds in the market in Lincolnshire than there are people to fill them, there is the temptation for providers to take a lower fee rate than they perhaps should do. One of the things our good relationship with the sector allows us to do is to have conversations with the market about facilitating a smooth exit from the market for some providers so that there is a better balance between supply and demand.
Andrew, please.
Thank you, Chair. The scenario that Martin has outlined about working age adults and children, etc., particularly for LD autism, severe mental health patients, is as clear as I've heard for some time. Thank you. That you articulate that analysis so clearly leads me to a frustration and a bemusement that others whose the subject is their main day job, i.e. mental health trusts, ICBs, etc., either do not understand it or do not have the courage, the capacity or the leadership to take it on. So exactly what Martin said, I find in 7 or 8 cases every Monday afternoon in Derbyshire. And we are horrified at the price we have to pay. And there are questions about quality as well, because we don't know them very well in the way that we know the partnership trust facilities, etc. So the challenge to you, Martin, is this is exactly why ICBs were set up, for the relevant partners in handling and caring for the most complex people in society, bearing in mind that society's purse is going to pay for them somewhere, either in prison or in a local authority budget or a healthcare budget, that the ICB should be the vehicle for them to get together and say, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And if it means moving resource from this budget to that budget to that budget, so be it. The public purse as a whole will get better value for money. The disappointment for me is they've had 2.5 years to think about this in ICBs, and I don't see that sort of thinking happening. So is it worth you going round that maypole again, Martin, and seeing if you can broker a fresh thinking approach?
So a couple of some very good points you make there, Councillor. So a couple of thoughts. I think one is inevitably we see things differently from an adult social care perspective, because our engagement with people tends to be a long-term engagement where we look at the individual and we're looking about their quality of life. I think it is almost inevitable that the medical model is to look at a condition and an episode of care. And so you do something with the individual and they move away, and you deal with the next individual and they move away. And so I think it's quite different and difficult for the NHS to think of people with a long-term life as opposed to a series of finished consultant episodes or operations undertaken. So in a sense, the NHS model and medical model tends to be focused on episodic intervention, and adult social care tends to be focused on the quality of life of an individual. And if you're dealing with hip replacements or whatever, then that's, the medical model works really very well. If you're dealing with people who have a lifelong disability, then I think it works rather less well. So I think it's quite challenging for the NHS in the way that it's set up to deal with that. You asked whether the ICB has a role in this. To some extent, the NHS nationally has been quite deliberately and consciously moving ICBs away from being involved in that part of health delivery, and delegating that instead to the mental health trusts. And so, in effect, the mental health trust itself almost is given, here's the money for mental health and learning disability, off you go, you deal with that, rather than it being part of the broader picture. And I think that has its strengths and weaknesses, but I think it does mean that it's quite hard for the ICB then to think in that way. They're very much drawn into the hospital flow and the like. So I think it's those two issues about the way the NHS is set up from a managerial perspective and the way the NHS operates from a medical model. Both of those, I think, make it quite difficult for them to have that long-term conversation about there are people with a lifelong need who are going to be in the system for 50, 60, 70 years, and how can we ensure that they have the best possible quality of life at the lowest costs to the public purse. And really the NHS just isn't set up to have that kind of conversation, whereas adult social care, that's our bread and butter. I'm not sure that's an answer, but it's a reflection. Yes.
Thank you, Martin. Paul.
Yeah, listening to the debate, and it's really quite interesting. But there is a need. The needs assessment is crucial to this, and there's a couple of things conflicting in reports. So the needs assessment, making sure that individual actually receives the care they need, is really crucial to this. And then on the other hand, we're talking about the possibility of a cheaper place. Well, unfortunately, when you move somebody that's been in a place for a long time, the outcomes for that individual aren't very great if you choose to move them. And there's nothing in this report that equates the proper need, to anything other than a budget. So I would like an explanation around that.
So adult social care is based on a fundamental principle that people should be able to have the best quality of life that they can. And so the Care Act, which is a very good piece of legislation, Care Act 2014, places people's quality of life at the centre of what adult social care does. Your point about the impact on individuals when we move them, it's a very real consideration, and there is sadly very significant evidence that, for example, if a care home closes and all of the residents are required to move, then there will be quite a proportion of the residents are likely to die within a fairly short period of time. Not because of necessary changes in the quality of care that's provided to them, but just the disruption and the upheaval. So it's always a factor that we are very, very careful to consider, and therefore quite often the council will end up paying a higher fee rate than we would wish to, because someone perhaps has been a self-funder, they've placed themselves in a care home, they've then run out of funds. That rate that they're paying is higher than the council would normally pay, and we've then had to make a decision, what's best for the individual? Is it better for us to move them and pay a lower rate, or is it better for us to leave them and pay a higher rate? And increasingly we are finding that we need to leave the individual where they are and pay the higher the higher rate. But that's an impact on the budget, so it's better quality of life for them. But it is one of those factors that is driving us. It is I'm very clear in the guidance to the social workers within the directorate. They need to be really clear about an individual's needs and make a needs-based decision on what that person should receive. We then need to make sure that they are genuinely receiving the care that they need and that we are getting that at the best available price. Debbie was previously talking about some of the situations we have in the children's residential world where sometimes quite high fees can be charged and it can be quite difficult to understand quite why that level of fee is being charged. We don't have that issue in the older people's market, but we do sometimes have it in the working age adults market. It is noticeable that a number of the companies that operate in the children's residential market are now moving into the working age adults residential market, and we are seeing some of the similar behaviours. As you might expect, therefore, we challenge the amounts that we are being quoted in terms of fee rates for those placements. So there's a national model that's been developed by an organisation down in the southeast that we use that allows you to calculate what level of care someone needs based on their needs assessment, and then to calculate what the cost of that should be. And it provides us a balance to say, well, if someone's asking us for £10,000 a week, we can run them through this model, and it might say, well, actually, probably it should be £8,000 a week, and we can have a conversation. But this is always based on the needs of the individual, and they have a statutory entitlement for their needs to be met. So we always have to work within that, and then make sure that the budget fits with that. Trying to measure people's quality of outcomes is really tricky. There is a national survey. The sample size isn't particularly good, and therefore the robustness of the figures isn't particularly strong. But we do always keep an eye on that.
Issues. Just one question. I think I've asked this before in sort of previous combined assurance reports that we've had. Do we know could you inform us what the current ratio between self-funders and LCC funded places there is? What percentage might that be? And also, in terms of just going back to the financial issues as well, the national insurance rise, in terms of, like I said, the fragility of some of the suppliers we have in adult social care, do those providers realise that is going to put, I'm sure they do, put an immense pressure on them in terms of not only the minimum wage, but ratcheting up the employers and and I know from a budget point of view the local authority has been looking at the implications of that, as Andrew has said, and I'll refer to later. Thank you.
So in terms of the first of your questions, the ratio between local authority funded and self-funded individual, I'm afraid I don't have those figures at the front of my mind. I think I'm right in saying, it will vary between different parts of the sector. So as I said, for working age adults, the vast majority of individuals are local authority funded individuals. For older people, I think I'm right in saying, but I would have to go and check the figures, that there is broadly a sort of, it's roughly equal, I think, in terms of self-funders and local authority funded individuals, but it's quite difficult to keep a track of the market. We've got a better sense in terms of residential care because we know the number of homes, we know all the homes that are registered, we know how many beds they have, we know how many beds we pay for. We can make estimates as to the number of beds that other councils and the NHS fund, and therefore by a process of elimination the rest are self-funded, but that's not a particularly robust way, but but my understanding, I think it's about 50-50. It is shifting increasingly towards council-funded places because we are seeing self-funders more and more run out of money. So people simply haven't got the funding. In terms of the national insurance contributions, I think providers are extremely aware of the impact that will have on them, and I think the figures that are being quoted are that for an average part-time member of staff, the additional cost is in the region of £615, per member of staff. That is the equivalent. Yes, I mean, it's equivalent about a week's work for an individual. So we are working closely with providers to ensure that they do understand what the implications are, and then, as I say, we are developing proposals for a targeted mitigation approach, which would allow us to provide some additional funding for providers that are particularly impacted. But that piece of work is still underway.
One question on the back of that to conclude, Martin. We see, as you said, external private sector suppliers being very interested in the higher margins that can be made from vulnerable adult care in the community, etc. In terms of the elderly, are there sort of some opportunities, and I use the word opportunities in the worst sense there, to be by some in the sector to try and squeeze out some of the more independent adult care social providers for the elderly, and then sort of give much less choice to people about where they live and everything, and the quality of care they're going to get in old age?
So focusing on the older people's market, I think it's very true that we are nationally seeing a consolidation of the market, that sort of exaggerating for effect, but only to a small extent. The older people's market used to be, the older people's residential market traditionally was large converted houses, Victorian houses often, run by a married couple who would own and run and manage the property. What we've progressively seen is that is not a financially viable model anymore. The homes are too small, and the buildings are not able to meet the modern requirements. So there's been a steady trend to much larger care homes. 50 or 60 beds is often the smallest that is viable. Purpose-built homes, those tend to be funded by larger national organisations. Increasingly, those are part of, they're funded by venture capitalists and the like. And as those more traditional care homes, as the owners reach retirement age themselves, they are tending to sell up and the homes be converted back into housing. And indeed, I've quite often seen a position where the value of the property is more than the value of the business. So yes, we're seeing a steady consolidation. Lincolnshire is much less far down that route than many other parts of the country, but it does mean that increasingly we're dealing with a relatively small number of large national companies as opposed to a large number of owner providers. That does mean that the negotiating position of the council is rather reduced, and of course it also means that there's a greater demand for profit, because if you're owning and running your own home, you need a certain level of profit. If it is an arm of a large corporation with shareholders, then there is a different dynamic.
Very last thing, you did mention the local authorities in building homes that the elderly could spend a lot of their decreasingly able life in terms of sort of having lifts or the ability to put in hoists and things like that in bathrooms as a secondary add-on. And I know that's taken place with some accommodation that they're built in Welton. So there is opportunity there to look to the longer term when somebody goes into a home, that property, if you like, can grow with them.
So there are a couple of aspects of that. One is there's significant potential actually for people to remain in their own homes with adaptations, and successive governments have significantly increased the Disabled Facilities Grant, which is a grant that comes through the county council, but we are merely the postbox for them. Every single penny of it then goes to the districts to enable them to fund adaptations to individual people's homes. One challenge we have there is that the government has, as I say, successive governments have significantly increased the DFG, but that has to be spent on the adaptation of the home. What governments haven't done is increase the funding to the county council to pay for the occupational therapists who do the assessments to work out what the adaptation needs to be. Now, we're doing very well in Lincolnshire. We have very, very short waiting lists, but it is increasingly being a challenge that funding is going to the districts to pay for the adaptation, but not to us to work out what the adaptation should be. In terms of adaptations to care homes, I say this is one of the things where the traditional Victorian vicarage or whatever simply can't be adapted in that way, and it does make much more sense to have purpose built, and so therefore the quality of life and the value for money, the operating value for money of the facility can be much better, but it does tend to change the market quite significantly.
So that's very informative. Thank you once again. Thank you. So if we can now, I think we're now moving on to Mark. Thank you, Mark, for fire and rescue. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll go through what the main areas that we've identified in the report. What's probably moved and shifted from last year to this year, the recruitment and retention is more specifically focused in regards to on-call firefighters and the ability to maintain the availability and the response on those stations. The transition from being quite a broader recruitment and retention concern last year was around our specialist areas within the organisation, particularly our protection officers. That is in a far more stable position, and we have been put in some good training and recruitment positions where we are well established in those areas. The areas which relates to on-call firefighters is on the trend over the last 5 years, where we are seeing a reduction in the availability on those on-call fire stations. Over the last 5 years, we've dropped from about 86% down to about 80%. So we're seeing a decrease, and that is continual year on year. What we are seeing, there's a reduction in our overall numbers of on-calls. So we probably 5 years ago was expecting to be employing about 400 on-call firefighters. We're now around about the 380 mark. And the other area that we've seen a longer term direction of travel, about 15 years ago, the average retention of an on-call firefighter was probably between 13 and 15 years. Now we're looking at just under 4 years. So that means there's a significantly more turnover of on-call firefighters as well. What we recognise that, and this trend absolutely mirrors every single fire and rescue service across the country has got on-call firefighters. So we are in no different position. In fact, looking at the national trend, we are still in the top third of availability for on-call firefighters in the country, and overall availability for our appliances. We are pretty much smack bang in the middle of all services across the UK. So areas that this is an area where we really need to look at and have different thinking and different models on how we ensure that our on-call firefighting model is sustainable for the future. It has been a very traditional way we've recruited on-call firefighters. We've relied on having a very narrow curtilage of 5 minutes within each station where people are either living on, working and making themselves available. We're in the process of doing some quite sophisticated modelling in regards to future demographics of all areas that have on-call stations, to actually look at what is the amount of personnel within that 5 minute curtilage that are of working age, that will be considered having the right quality and attributes and physical fitness to be able to firefighter. And then there is a broad benchmark of actual percentage of those people who actually want to be a firefighter. What we do recognise are in some areas those numbers that we can even proactively recruit against are in the 10s and 20s. So it's going to be more challenging. So we're challenging our assumptions that actually, do we always need to be recruiting within 5 minutes? Can we look at different ways how we can stagger our response and weight of attack to operational incidents? Can we make sure that we don't ensure that we look at the same way on every single station without compromising our response standards, our timing that we get to fires, and ensure that we've got a scale and concurrency model that ensures that we've always got the amount of appliances available that can meet, not just if we're responding to one incident, but a large-scale incident or a medium-scale incident, and ensuring that we can maintain that over many, many hours. We are looking at a data and evidence-based research in regards to what that modelling will look like, and then we're going to be looking at how we can improve our recruitment campaigns. There's more to do to get our hard-to-reach areas in some of our low-risk areas. So we have some stations that have a relatively low activity. However, they're still really essential to have personnel on those stations, because when we do get incidents, and I'll use the example of wide-scale flooding that we have across the county, we may not need them to have an immediate response, but we definitely need those personnel to support those ongoing incidents. So the recruitment and retention of our on-call firefighters is a real focus for us that we are continuing with for the rest of the year. Our other area was culture, which is a positive direction of travel. This was on the back of our previous HMIC FRS inspection report, which we got about 18 months ago. That's where we still had a cause of concern for how people understood the culture and understood what diversity was within our organisation. From that point, we've done some really targeted work, particularly in regards to how we've had a continual training programme to all of our personnel. We have had a real significant focus of retraining and on how we deliver our equality impact assessments, particularly on key decisions in regards to how our buildings, our estates, and our equipment, and ensuring that we've got a quality assurance process to ensure that they are being suitable and sufficient. And one of the key areas that we needed to improve was how we communicate to all of our staff. We've always found that traditionally a challenge because of the makeup of our organisation. The majority of our staff, which again are our on-call, are not available 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. They are available at all different times during the working day, and they have a myriad of ways of how the best way to connect and communicate with them. So we've brought in a new role of our communication engagement manager, and she's been doing some amazing work that has really developed our intranet, our briefings, one-to-one cascade briefings, which we've been getting some really positive feedback, and the messages are landing really, really well. Legislative changes, this is an area where we're highlighting because there is an element of uncertainty, because there's quite a few national agendas that are playing through the fire sector that may have an impact on us. Probably one of the most significant is what's potentially impact of the Grenfell Tower recommendations from the tragedy of the 72 people that lost their lives. The report came out a few months ago, so that nationally there's a lot of work looking at that relationship between inspecting of high-risk buildings in regards to the relationship of how we train to ensure that our operational crews have the right skills, have the right knowledge in regards to how to deal with these complex buildings. And there's also, it links into the fire reform agenda, which is, again, government have mentioned previously about implementing a national standards across the board that everybody trains to and everybody has the right qualifications, the right skills to go through. So that is being monitored, and we're engaged with a national level through the National Fire Chiefs Council to look at what those impacts may have on us. So at the moment we don't know what that landscape may look like. But currently we're in a good position. So in regards to how we currently train and ensure that we've got the confidence, that we've got competent and confident operational staff, we are already aligned to what the current national standards are, and we regularly monitor that, and on average we're about 98% of our staff are competent in all skills, and where the areas of the 2% is, then they don't partake in whatever is that specific discipline until they have got themselves upskilled. So we are always operating that we are confident that 100% of our staff are operating within their realms of responsibilities. Other areas that does link into is the ongoing contaminants agenda. That is again some ongoing research, and there is a direction of travel, recognising that there's been a lot of historical evidence that the fire service could be classed as a carcinogenic workplace in regards to how previously firefighters have been exposed to incidents and events. And again, I think this is also recognising that actually in recent years our ways of working have significantly changed. Our equipment has significantly changed. How we ensure that our firefighters at operational incidents routinely disrobe. They are very more aware and conscious of the risk of contaminants. But that may play through in regards to legislative requirements under the Health and Safety at Work Act. But again, that is something that again we are actively involved in research through the National Fire Chiefs Council and Home Office in regards to ensuring that we are best placed. But I'm confident at the moment Lincolnshire is in a good position on ensuring that we are protecting our firefighters. And then also with the legislative changes, we, as with everybody else, will be looking at how local government reform agenda could or may have an impact in regards to fire and rescue services across the UK, and Lincolnshire will probably be in no different position in regards to that. The final area that I'm just trying to touch on is our Command and Control Centre project that we brought to the Audit Committee last year. And again, there's been really positive work in regards to that since we reported it at the last Audit Committee. We're in a confident position that we've got good resilience in place. We are still looking at the goal for the 31st of March 2025 for a transition into our new mobilising system. We have, however, invested £155,000 to have an agreement with our existing consortium as a safety net. So if for whatever reason then we go past that 31st of March, we still have a continuation of our current command and control system. So there won't be any reason why we will not be without a command and control system. And then we've also got a third safety net in regards to already agreed national arrangements, whereas any other service could pick up the 999 calls if we require, which is sometimes often used if we across the UK, if we have extremely high volume amount of calls. An example where that came in operation was a couple of years ago when we had those extreme hot weather events in the July and August, and pretty much most services across the country were getting significant amount of calls. And in fact, on that occasion, we in Lincolnshire took calls and managed calls from many other areas within the UK. So Command and Control project is still looking for 31st of March for being on target. There is a potential it could go a few weeks after that. However, even that is, we've got some mitigation where we can review elements, for example, the amount of user acceptance test times that we put in within the project plan Do we need all that amount of time? But the direction of travel, I'd rather prefer we get it right than to rush it, especially because we know that we've got a resilience in place that the people, our people of Lincolnshire, if they'll dial 999, they will always get through to our command and control centre. So and in regards to the final element, in regards to the budget, we are still looking at the whole project to still come within the £5.6 million project that we put through there. So the forecasting is that we will still be on target for that budget. And I'm happy to pause and take questions. Thank you.
I'm sorry if I'm always pushing in to take the first slot. I do look and see if anybody else has got their hands up. Anyway, I've got two questions, but one of them to a certain extent was to do with the control centre and the 31st of March, which I think you've answered to a certain extent. It'd be interesting to know whether you've got a launch event scheduled for the day, or that's going to be something that sort of comes in over stages as time passes. So perhaps we'll just leave that question. The more interesting question to a certain extent is, if you do have to alter the sort of response times, I do appreciate the difficulty because you explain that quite clearly in terms of retention of your, I was going to say part-time firefighters, but you know, sorry?
Retained one.
I've what?
Retained firefighters.
Retained, oh, that's the right term, retained firefighters. So I do understand the background to it. But if you do have to end up altering response times of the firefighters themselves because they no longer live as close to the fire stations as they used to do, or whatever, and you said that you were hoping to maintain the actual sort of event response times, so there's no sort of benefit to the public in terms of, you know, having the attention of the firefighters, you know, to whatever the event is, you know, car crash or fire at home or whatever it is. How do you actually do that? Because it does seem to be, you know, contradictory to a certain extent, because if you're pushing one forward, you expect to push the other one forward, unless you've got supercharged fire engines and you can drive at a far faster speed.
A good question, and so we've done some initial modelling, and so if I can probably explain what we would do currently. So if we've got a fire station that is off the run because it hasn't got the required amount of people to mobilise that appliance, we'll send the next nearest station. Now, the next nearest station could be 10, 15 or 20 minutes away. So that response time is going to be delayed. So if we had, if we was only able, and because we're only recruited within 5 minutes, that station's off the run. If we increase that curtilage to, say, potentially 7 minutes, that will increase the amount of people that would be available. And although it would make them another 2 minutes slower getting into the station, it would still be quicker than to call a fire engine that's probably 15 or 20 minutes away. So we can't do it on every station, and we need to make sure that that's why we need to do the modelling to work out how we can make the most, find that most efficient sweet spot, for want of a better term. But at the moment, the more appliances that go off the run, then what we're having to do is we're having to spread further away to get the next nearest appliance. So it's sometimes better for us to have an appliance that is available that'll be slightly slower to get out the door than it is to actually rely on a station that's available that may be 15 or 20 minutes away, if that makes sense.
Well, it's a good explanation anyway, and it does explain the situation. So what you're saying, I think, is your response times are variable.
It's a long time since I worked in Lincolnshire's colleges, but in my college we had 100 pre-uniform services students. I would reckon there are 500 to 600 throughout the county. Are you targeting that group for retained?
So we do work with schools and colleges in regards to that, and we are linked in with the uniform courses. What we have found is, though, that they are the group of people that are generally looking for full-time careers within emergency services, and not necessarily the community-based people that are enabling themselves to be available for on-call. So as we are targeting now, however, we don't get the same rate of return for our on-call establishment rather than the whole time.
Full, etc. But we do have coma sites and everything, dealing with fertilism and everything in Lincolnshire. Slightly different concerns, but obviously we have a fire and rescue team at Waddington and everything as well. So we have probably different issues, but I'm sure you're on board with all of those. So thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to start by emphasising one of the points that Debbie made earlier. I think the report you've got in front of you reflects a refined process of the engagement between the services and the corporate audit team, particularly in the context of the alignment of our service-related risks feeding up into the strategic risks and then ultimately into these sort of type of reports. And I think that's something which hopefully gives us a better level of assurance in terms of some of the questions that have been asked by members of the committee earlier. Like my colleagues, I'll just focus in quickly in respect of the 6 key areas that we've identified in the report from the Place Directorate. Like everyone else, budget and financing coming out up there as a particular pressure. The overriding financial pressures Andrew's touched on earlier, and no doubt we'll touch on again when you hear from him shortly. But that, of course, does relate into service-related risks and pressures. Particularly in those universal services within the Place Directorate, which rely quite heavily on a demand-led approach. I probably won't get through this session without somebody mentioning potholes at some point, but as you expect, the more the demand goes up and the more there are pressures on our budgets, we have to make choices. At the moment, we are managing to deliver within the context of our asset management plan. But as I'm sure you'll all have local examples of where you might want to identify that where you perhaps feel that the sort of delivery could be different. The council's budget over the last few years has always been topped up to fill the gap left by some of the DFT cuts that have been made in the past. And you've seen the benefit as local councillors of the programmes of activity that we've been able to actually deliver as a consequence of that. There is a risk, of course, if overall budget provision from the DFT falls, and if there are other pressures on the council, then the ability to continue those type of programmes and interventions may be compromised as we go forward. Linked into that, there are pressures on individual projects, and that's related, I think, in perhaps the way that Councillor Allen referred earlier about question marks about government funding decisions. For example, there isn't yet clarity of whether the DFT contribution to the North Highcombe Relief Road will be forthcoming. It's tied into a wider review of DFT budgets, DFT capacity. In the meantime, we'll continue to make sure that we take that project forward, hit all of the milestones that we are in direct control of. That's likely to result in a public inquiry later in the spring in respect of the compulsory orders procedures. That enables us to be as best placed as we can to convince the DFT that it's a project that should continue to be funded. Obviously, if the DFT remove their £110 million contribution, I imagine Andrew might have something to say about that. So there are risks that we are managing, matters that are in our control, matters that are perhaps outside of our control. In terms of educational travel, which stays on the list from last year, you'll be aware that's now part and parcel of our strategic risk register, so it's been elevated in the context of the risk that it brings to the organisation. Again, some of that's in relation to delivery, some of it's in relation to the funding impacts. The overall delivery of the service is part and parcel of our corporate transformation programme, with regular updates being provided into the executive and a risk management structure around that accordingly. What that has resulted in is a greater degree of control over the budget elements reflected in this year's sort of budget position. It's still unfortunately beyond our current budgeted position. Other matters that are being addressed reflect the trying to manage the demand activity, look at how we can stimulate the market effectively, but some of those matters will take time to actually be addressed. And again, as Debbie referred to earlier, this is inextricably linked to the wider SEND issues and the expectation or hope that there may be some change at a national level. Energy from waste, we've identified again, and that relates a little bit both to the operational activities of managing the waste that is presented. Increased waste being presented puts greater pressure on the facility. That resulted in unplanned outages last year, which has an impact then on the management of the service. Again, we continue to make contingencies with the operator about how to actually address those. And we continue to plan ahead for the legislative change that is particularly in respect of the extended producer responsibility for packaging. You'll also hear that referred to as the extended packaging responsibilities. EPR does come with some financial incentives, which have been confirmed at around £7.5 million for the next financial year. But there are specific requirements that we need to make sure are implemented in the context of how producers actually comply with the expectations of reducing the packaging, therefore reducing the amount of waste that is presented. There are other legislative changes in respect to food waste, which we are working through in partnership with the districts, and part and parcel of mitigation for that is to make sure that the household, waste transfer stations are being updated to enable us to deal with how the waste is now presented in a different way. So we are planning ahead, albeit the problems of the legislation being delayed have caused some issues in implementation of that. Devolutions identified within the Place Directorate, because most, if not all, of the activities relating to the activity of the Greater Lincolnshire Combined Authority are services or activities that are currently delivered through either the Place Directorate or in partnership through relationships with the previously with the LEP. That creates a level of uncertainty, and whilst we are managing through in the context of the three constituent authorities, the structure, the capacity that is put in place, that does run the risk of creating some uncertainty in the short term. For example, Lincolnshire County Council will not be the transport authority going forward, like North and North East Lincolnshire Councils won't be for their areas, so the combined authority will become the transport authority. We're currently going through a process of looking at the options in respect of how that will mean the combined authority needs to be constructed to actually deliver those functions and to interact with the three constituent authorities. So again, it's about managing the risk, putting measures in place to be able to control that as and when changes are made. And as you're aware, obviously the combined authority will come into existence this spring with the first mayoral elections in May. Employee safety is one of those areas where there's a little bit of a disconnect between perhaps the perception and reality. Again, we have an awful lot of frontline staff who are dealing with perhaps challenging situations and circumstances, the volatility of human nature, the increased use of social media by people to actually highlight activities which they believe to be wrong and such like. So we're going through a process of understanding the reality of that risk and looking at actually the measures that may need to be put in place to protect people from inappropriate behaviour if that's actually a key issue. And then the final one that's identified in the report is about climate adaptation. The easy reference for this from a Lincolnshire perspective is in the context of our risks from flooding events. The events of the last 12 to 18 months with storms Babette and Henk and the activity again at the beginning of this calendar year identify the real world impacts that flooding actually has. You have to remember, in the context of our ability to respond effectively to this, a third of the county area is under sea level, and in addition to that we also have the pressures of fluvial flood risk, rainwater type events and groundwater events. We've currently got projects and activities underway working with our partners to develop strategies for looking at the coastal defences. We've also got a groundwater project that is being conducted in partnership with the Environment Agency with funding from DEFRA. So again, we are putting in place the measures to hopefully create adaptation measures, but that doesn't remove the risk of when events actually take place and the close working relationship then we have with organisations like the Fire and Rescue and the Emergency Planning Team that falls under Mark to work to actually address what actually happens in practice. Again, the devolution deal includes a commitment for enhanced water partnership, which hopefully might give us a mechanism to work more closely and directly with DEFRA, as well as the local partner agencies, to actually look at long-term solutions to the risks that are associated with those type of events in the county. At a strategic level, though, over the last few months, we have moved forward with actually developing what's called an adaptation strategy, which again will put some sort of detail into the areas where we can actually make some changes into actually how we need to look at thinking ahead and building in the mechanisms that are needed to remove the risk, not just from flood risk, but from other aspects of climate impact. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Andy. Andrew.
I really became alert when you mentioned the transfer of transport, education transport, to the mayoral authority. This county has recognised the need for potentially a higher spend on transport in order to facilitate access to education and other services. There has to be a real risk that a different authority might not have the same priority. So how can we ensure, as far as we possibly can, that the case is made that funding transport, although a high ticket cost, is absolutely essential for so many services and quality of life provisions?
Yeah, so the devolution deal, and it's enshrined in the devolution white paper, is that the mayoral combined authorities become the transport authority. So that is a position that is being established nationwide. In the context of the optioneering work that I referenced, that is a piece of work to understand what are the options of where roles and responsibilities actually lie. The delivery of educational transport is still a function of the local authority, not of the combined authority. However, you are right to identify that there is a relationship between the two activities, and the way in which we currently deliver educational travel could be impacted upon if the transport authority functions and the relationship with the bus operators was done in a different way. At this moment in time, the prioritisation of activity that has been established by the three constituent authorities has identified transport as being one of the key activities and functions within the combined authority. And there was a report that went to the Joint Strategic Oversight Committee at the end of last month, which held with the three leaders of the constituent authorities, where a fair amount of debate actually took place regarding the link between training, skills, and moving people to their respect. So at this moment in time, given the dialogue, discussions, and rhetoric that is being talked through, and the programmes of work that are being talked through, I don't think that will come to fruition. That's not to deny it could be a risk if the organisation decided to move in a different direction.
And it's very informative. And again, we'll, in terms of the devolution settlement, obviously that's still in the mix, isn't it? And obviously we want to, you know, as local members as well as we all like to see our local roads well maintained and everything else, but we do understand that you know, there's a load of difficult decisions involved in which ones you do. So thank you very much for that. Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, it's a case of last but not least, hopefully. But yeah, so as I said when I answered some of the questions earlier, obviously probably stolen some of the thunder and responses already. So obviously in terms of budget and funding, if there's any more questions from the committee on anything finance-wise, happy to take those, but not planning to say any more on that now, other than just building on the feedback before around AI in response to Councillor Coupland's question. One of the things that I've asked my directorate to look at is around how we can utilise automation more to help us contribute to you know, upcoming financial savings, really, and that'll probably become a factor of these reports and others as we go forward. Moving on to the next main area, again I talked about reprocuring the IT contract earlier. Another big reprocurement that we're going through at the moment is around the property services contract, and that's been broken into two specific parcels essentially. At the moment we've got one contract with Vinci that does everything for us but sublets some of it to Kia, We took the decision last year, probably about 18 months ago, to break that contract up into two parts. One definitely focused still on FM, and that's been let and has been let to Vinci, but is a brand new contract utilising a different contractual method basically to give us more control. I think one of the things that we've acknowledged is we've not got the best out of the existing property contract, and been taking steps with the leadership in property to strengthen that as we've gone through that process. And then a separate professional services contract which will deliver better savings for the council. Again, one of those areas where we've probably not got the best value for money as time's gone by over the last 10 years of that contract. So one that we've really been putting a lot of effort in terms of making sure it's the right thing for the council, is project specific, I guess, rather than carrying overhead costs. So big year for that, but it's progressing well, and not one that I'm particularly concerned about in terms of us transitioning to the new contract. This particular report's always had something around what we call the Corporate Support Services Programme. That's the next item to discuss. That is relatively a small entity now in terms of what we've got in terms of outsourced services. So predominantly only now got the IT contract and the customer services contract left with Serco now. Everything else has either been brought in-house or repurposed. So this time last year we were talking about the risks of the insourcing and all the work that we thought that would entail, so that whether that was bringing in the financial services team back into Michelle's area, or the payroll functionality back into the HR department. Those transfers went well. However, what it has shown us is there is a lot of transformation still required in those services. So I think one of the learning points that we've got, and I know we've got less outsourced in the corporate space now, but it does demonstrate that for things like the customer service centre, IT and property services, the massive importance of strong contract management, ensuring that we're getting the best out of the supplier. Because I think what we've seen as we brought those functions in, as I say, financial services and payroll, historically contract management hasn't probably been as good as it can be. We should always be on to our suppliers, ensuring that they provide maximum value for money and transformation to ensure that we're getting better from them. And I don't think we have had that looking back now. So Michelle's area and Tony Kavanagh's area in HR have got a lot of transformation work ongoing at the moment to ensure that those functions are fit for purpose. So I just wanted to reflect on that too. We talked about IT again already, so there's not much more to add on that, but I'm happy to take any further questions that might emanate from that. And then last, mirroring Andy's response really on devolution, I think I'd say it's the day job's changed, I guess, over the last 18 months whilst we've been pursuing the mayoral combined authority. So a lot of additional capacity being used to provide legal support, programme management and what have you. So that means we've had to reprioritise, reprogram the pace of which we were doing the other day job, I guess. And I guess if, as the mayoral combined authority takes shape and comes online, and whether there are any other initiatives that we become involved with as a result of the recent white paper, whether it's LGR, what have you, really got to be mindful of the organisational weight that takes in terms of pursuing those things, and that's just a response to that really. So that's mine for resources really, acknowledging that I covered quite a bit earlier. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Andrew. Ian.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Andrew. Probably there's a question that's tying into some of the stuff we're going to see in Claire's paper on the internal audit. I just want to ask that question now. You talked about what we call stagnation in contracts, where effectively you're not incentivising to evolve, especially some of the bigger ones. You very politely put what that looks like coming back into the business. It's the same thing with Business World. I've been sat here for a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away for many years now, and we've seen Business World mentioned for many years. It's dropped off from 24 to 25 off the risk register, yet I also know we've still got some very old internal audit recommendations still sat there with Business World. So my one question is, why is it not on there, or if it is, in what form is it? Because it doesn't necessarily feel like we've resolved it to a point where it shouldn't be on there.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So in its previous guise, it was on here predominantly related to the implementation of the new improvements. and that was massive. It was strategic, and it impacted upon everybody. And clearly, we came through that implementation well, without any issues such as the ones that we'd had 10 years previously. You're right. Business World does still present challenges, and it's more around how we get the most out of using it. So I think around how I talked about in the budget and funding element for my area about how we automate and work better with our systems in the back office. Michelle's area is a good example of that one. There was lots more that we could do to make ourselves a slicker operation, but the system, whilst not necessarily being an impediment to that, is something that we have to consider in terms of how we get information out of the ERP and how we use it most effectively. Again, some of that's linked into what I talked about before around IT and ensuring that we've got an appropriate data platform as well, and how we can manipulate it and make it slicker. So there are, as I say, there are issues still. There's a report going to the executive tomorrow, for example, around moving the provision from an on-premise to a software as service cloud-based functionality as well. That presents risks as well, but none of them in and of their own right are enough to, I'd class them as strategic level that I'd put on here. But it will always be, managing your ERP will always be a thorn in one side, no matter whether it's perfect or not, I think.
I understand the position, like I say, is that bit I mentioned earlier before about death by 1,000 cuts. And I think that's the thing for me is happy to take your assurance now. Happy to say it's reduced into it's more opportunities than risk potentially in some of these areas. But I think that's the key thing for me is I'm probably going to come back to you in 6 months' time, which will be say is if that is the case, if that is where we're tracking and we're trying to get on this one, those internal audit actions, I can't remember what they are, apologies off the top of my head, what they are outstanding. Either they've been addressed or they're no longer a concern or a risk. And there's a broader question when we get to the audit paper, which I've spoken to Claire about those. It's become an enabler. It may not be brilliant. It's not a risk. And I think that's what I'm going to be looking for in 6 months' time, if that's okay.
Thank you, Ian. Any further questions?
Hello, Andrew. Would you like to elucidate on the statement that you got in your report that aligning ourselves with national standards, NIST's national standards, is going to result in our ability to benchmark and remain up to date with best practice? Does best practice automatically come from national standards?
Well, I think there's some external emphasis being placed upon us to try and start to follow this. There's something called the Cyber Security Framework that's come in recently that the government have brought in, that they're trying to acknowledge that I guess all parts of society haven't necessarily moved with the times in terms of ensuring that they've got appropriate cyber security methodologies. And obviously we've had our own internal review of that prior to that becoming a thing, when obviously as I said earlier, we've invested heavily in it to ensure that we're in as good a position as possible. But I think external benchmarking is always a good thing if you can demonstrate that you've made progress and you're tracking ahead of your peers, I think, because it shows you on the right track and you can provide some reassurance that you've been doing the right sort of thing, really.
Well, if you benchmark yourself, it does depend on, the capabilities of what you're benchmarking against, which is the issue I was getting at to a great extent. National standards, by the time you get to those, to get to a situation where you can benchmark against those national standards may no longer be the best practice by any means. I would say it's better than not being there, but it might not be the best situation.
I guess the main thing I'll say to the committee is we're serious about investing in this area and making ourselves as strong as we can possibly be, and it will be a continual programme, not least supported by that new approach with the new contractor.
Thank you, Andrew. Just one. It's just heard. Any further questions for Andrew? Just to conclude, Andrew, I know you said that we'd taken the budget pressures and everything as sort of read, but clearly if we've only got a 1-year settlement going forward, that makes things difficult in terms of predicting the future, and also this unknown. There are a lot of unknowns in terms of what the structure of this organisation is going to look like in 3 or 4 years' time, or even a year's time, and and also the fact that these national insurance increases are going to be insidious because they are going, although I take it the government will have some reimbursement mechanism for directly employed staff by the county council. There's a huge amount of what we do that is not directly funded by the county council. You said we've touched on children's services, adult social care, anything that's outsourced, and some of those organisations are going to have huge impacts on them. So, you know, knowing what those costs are going to be on us come the 6th of April, I know we've looked at that in the budget, is our best guess, isn't it? So we're going to have to keep a real tight rein on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd probably characterise this most recent budget we've been through. I've been a Section 155 officer for over 10 years now. And before that, I was obviously supporting, you know, budget setting processes. I think you have a budget like this that comes along probably every 5-6 years or something like that. It's been a real challenge, a lot of moving parts. I think the fact that, firstly, obviously some of the new government announcements around funding removal that Debbie talked about before, them in themselves, you know, losing £10 million overnight is a big deal. When you know, you've got £70 million of cost pressures in your budget, but then to have, you know, further policy change such as the national insurance one, you know, I think we'll probably receive. We're going to find out today, most likely in the final settlement that Debbie referred to as well. Probably something in the region of about £3 or £4 million reimbursement when across our in-house staff and the external provision. The costs are probably going to be in the region of about £18 million. That's not a great recovery rate by any stretch of the imagination. We've had to absorb that, and we've been able to this year because we've had those contingency savings that we've had lined up for moments like this. But obviously, once you've used them, obviously the list gets a bit shorter. So it is challenging. But I said a lot of it will hinge on some of the policy choices that the government make around the fair funding review, and the recovery grant that Debbie referred to earlier about money being moved into deprived areas is a, you know, professionally for me, and it's not a political comment, professionally concerning, because you know, even if you think about the combined effects or the compound effects of losing £3 or £4 million a year compared to what you've previously received, that obviously over a 4-year period you're talking sizable chunks of cash again. So that's obviously something that we're keeping a keen eye on. We're obviously reporting through the various consultations that are alive at the moment, but I say a lot of it will hinge on what comes out of that spending review, and indeed the size of the actual pie that they've got to divvy up as well, because the public finances and the profile within the public finances don't look particularly rosy either.
I think it's not been just a particular characteristic of this particular administration, but governments over many years have not looked too kindly on rural communities, unfortunately, because of population on one grounds and lack of understanding perhaps on another. So we've always had that dilemma. But it's just something I think we're going to have to cope with again, unfortunately. Yeah, we will hope that things will turn out better than we anticipate. But we are in a wonderful position because, you know, we've got all these public interest reports out there, absolute horror stories, what all the local authorities have done. I mean, quite horrific. We've been properly managed, and we've had wonderful staff, wonderful directors and everything, and we are not in that position. We are in a very, very enviable position in terms of lots of local authorities, I have to say. So, Ian, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. In a rare moment, Andrew, I do apologise in advance for this. It'll be a bit of a shock to the system for most people listening. As an accountant, there is a bandwidth capacity you can do when it comes to budgeting, about how many variables you can cope with. And I think it's just my counsel to this committee that, given the magnitude, the scale, the lack of control over some of these, I would hate to be trying to budget, because I guarantee you're going to be wrong, but by a magnitude we've probably not seen for 4 or 5 years, to the extent that the number of variables that will move up and down. So I think it's not only the speed and the change involved with this one. I think my counsel to this council is that we just need to understand if the radar stations are operating as efficiently and as effectively as we possibly need them to be, because those risks are going to manifest at a rate we've probably not seen for some time. And actually our ability to adapt will be one of those things. We've mentioned the reserves, we've mentioned about everything else, we've mentioned the council changes. There's a lot to go on. I think my counsel would be literally is we also need to make sure, as well as scrutinising and challenging and being a critical friend, we have to emphasise as much on the friend side as much as the critical side to support the exec as they go through this. Because I would not want to do this and put money on it.
Thank you, Ian. We'll heed your voice.
Sorry for the optimism on that point. I know you use that's the bit you're more used to. It's fine, but there you go.
I think we would all concur with you that it's not going to be an easy few years ahead. So thank you again. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, just very quickly, conscious of time for the committee. Obviously, the rest of the paper just did pick up on some of those points of areas of future risk that we're considering, that we have on our radar. As Debbie alluded to, being involved in national groups and central government groups does give us access to hopefully a wide range of those risks coming through. But obviously, we're always open to anything else that the committee also feels that we should be looking to consider. And then just moving on to the main areas of work for the team for next year, obviously continuing to embed risk management, and it was encouraging to hear that Debbie feels that overall the confidence levels across the directorates has improved in terms of managers in recognising and being able to control their risks, so that's positive. But our main feature for this year is actually looking at the whole appetite for the organisation as to how much risk we really feel we can take on. And where we're taking those risks outside of that appetite. So that's the biggest piece of work for this year.
Thank you, Mandy, and thank you to everyone who helped produce the report. It's very informative. Thomas, you did indicate perhaps we could just have 5 minutes a break. Hello everyone, so we'll resume our meeting. Thank you for bearing with us with that small rest break. So if we could then move on, having done the combined risk report, we can move on to the internal audit progress report. And Sarah is going to run us through this one. Thank you.
Thank you. So this report provides an update on progress made against the 24-25 annual audit plan. It specifically updates on progress made since the last progress report we presented in June 24. We don't have any concerns over the deliverability of the remainder of the plan, which will conclude in March, the end of March 25. Any audit activity yet to commence, which will be shown in the report, has been allocated appropriate resource. Delivery is sufficient also to inform the annual opinion, which will be presented back to committee in June 25. Improved client feedback, which has an increased focus on quality, has seen all three audit teams, that's the LCC team, districts team and the schools team, receive mostly very good or excellent results, and has been used to better effect by the management team to support us in identifying areas of improvements and efficiencies. There have been 2 limited assurance opinions awarded by the LCC team within 24-25. Management actions for those have been agreed or are still being agreed with the audit clients for those 2 audits, and they will form part of the team's audit oversight moving forward, follow-up activity. Follow-up activity took place in quarters 1 and quarters 2 of this financial year, and that resulted in the closure of 29 actions. But then audit delivery so far from 24-25 has identified a further 71 management actions. All of those are combined into a single system of oversight for the team to ensure that follow-up activity and closures of those actions take place. This report now does show overdue actions, which hasn't previously been reported. These are shown in Appendix 1 and 2. These also form part of the same system of oversight, and so follow-up activities will take place. Further activity specifically from quarters 1, 25, 26. I'm happy to take any questions on the report or its contents.
Thank you, Sarah. Ian.
Chair, I'll let you dictate how greedy I'm going to be because I've got 3 questions, so I'll let you take the steer. First thing is I'll start with the plan delivered 38% with a few months to go. Naturally jittery. I'll just leave it at the first question at that. Could you give me some assurance, please, of how we're going to close out 2/3 of the audit plan?
I can, and this is just representation in the graph that's been shown, and we can certainly take away feedback to improve the graphics there. So 38, the plan has been delivered in full, and when we say full, that means the final report has been issued. There are 5 audits that have been delivered, but they're just waiting for final report to be issued. As of today, 2 have actually already been sent, and 2 more are due to be sent. So within a day, that percentage will go up to 60-70%. But we're happy to take that feedback and produce better graphics within our reports to show if the work in progress is in the early stages of work in progress or if it's in the latter stages of work in progress, so you can get a better view of how much of the plan has actually been delivered.
Thank you. That storytelling, that was fun again. There's a reason why I tell you a lot in advance before I sit down and go to these questions. Second question, really, actually, maybe spanning into Andrew and to the rest of the team, Michelle's area. The contract award and exceptions. There's a story within that for me in terms of behaviour. It goes into the wider business areas. It's not just a finance thing. I think especially tied into all the stories we've heard today about the risk and about contracts, value for money and everything else. That is probably one of the most worrying reviews that I've seen in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of control, visibility, decision making and checking. Those sorts of things around we have rollovers. I've spoken to a few people. We've had rollovers of contracts. Understanding what happens if there's a plan B, what alternatives do we have? That for me is going to be absolutely prevalent in terms of the control environment we need to operate. And I just really like the Andrew's view as well as anything else as to what this report is telling you, because we're going to need, and Claire and the team are going to need that support to land this, because this is quite a concerning review for me. Number 2.
I'll come chair if that's okay. Yeah, so I think the audit's a fair crack. To be fair, it was a good report, and some helpful findings in there. So I think there's a number of things that have happened over the last year, whilst that review's been undertaken, and Claire and the team might want to add to it really. So obviously we have what I'd call it as a semi-federated version of running procurement in the council, but there are different pockets of teams that manage it in different areas, and I think that has led to one of the main findings in the paper essentially around record keeping not being as good as it should be, basically. So I don't think there's any suggestion from the audit that any bad decisions have been made, but it's more about how they are then recorded and demonstrated. Alongside that, Will is the new monitoring officer, chief legal officer, who came in. He's been with us for a year now. One of the things he's trying to ensure is that officer decisions are published appropriately as well, and that's something that we're working on at the moment. So alongside that too, a new assistant director for commercial as well, who's looking at essentially rebadging the internal procurement group that existed before and change its focus from sort of setting, work plan and sharing practice to ensuring things like this are nailed down properly and dealt with in a consistent fashion, because that's one of the main issues, is lack of consistency and appropriateness as well. So I'm really pleased that the team have found this, because I think it gives us a good basis to fix something which, as you rightly say, should be part of the intrinsic part of the control environment.
And I think when we get into those spaces, that there's some challenges around. You get the usual sniff test questions. Did you know? Why did you do that? And the answer is, especially when you have to do things like rollovers of contracts, you didn't know, somebody leaves, all these usual horror stories that we normally have. It's never going to be perfect, but we really need to be on top of those decision makings, especially as we go to those risk areas. So that's quite cool. My third and final question, back to Claire and to Sarah as well, we've already talked about this, is if you, in my personal view, if you've got any actions that are going past 2 or 3 years, they're stale. The reviews, the areas may have moved on. We need to have a way, and it may be again part of the storytelling, to say we've had another look, we need to redate them, we need to get that review, they've become refreshed. If we've got actions from 2020 onwards, we kind of mentioned it before about the IT systems. It's really making sure that they are real and we're changing behaviours, which is what the audit actions should be doing. And that for me would be a case of, it's an opportunity. I've already spoken to Claire about it. We'll have a look about presenting it back to us to say, do I feel that the actions that we're tracking, that the business have bought into, it's not a get out of jail free card. Boy, do they normally like that one. But it's really just making sure that we're holding them to account to real, relevant actions, and the business need to own that.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think it's, to pick up on the first point about the contract award, we've had really good engagement across the council. There hasn't been any pushback to say the audit was ineffective or it wasn't accurate. We've had good buy-in from the assistant director, and the desire to change has very much been there. So it is a very well supported audit, and it did land very well, very supportively. Just in relation to the follow-up reviews, and I think it's probably in the narrative of the report, when we had a change of management across IT, we did touch base, we did review all of the old findings. Some of the recommendations weren't appropriate to take forward. The ones that were, we had those conversations with the ADs and the head of service as they came in, and they have almost been rebadged. We've left them as the older ones because they are the same risks as were in place in 2021, but we've just realigned when we look at them. They are overdue at the moment, and it's something that we were planning to pick up on before the end of this year. Whether we can guarantee that, I don't know, which is why it's not in the report, but it's something that we will definitely pick up in Q1 of next year to get that update into where we are. But again, there was big buy-in from the new management team who arrived, who wanted to, no, we don't want to close these off. We actually want to take them forward in a guise so that we're held to account for making these changes.
Thank you. It's just a development to a certain extent of the example that Andrew Middleton brought up, and it's sort of inferred almost in page 8 of your report, or whatever it is of ours, which is the bar chart, and it's the feedback. Because one of the poor scores on that one is to do with the knowledge of risk and controls. I just wonder whether the processes that we talk about and that we've developed and that we're monitoring, are driven down to all parts of the organisation, or whether there's some elements or some processes taking place perhaps at a lower level that don't have the good practice and the risk management that takes place for the bigger items. Is that one reason why they don't necessarily see that we've got good? Their view is that there isn't a good knowledge of risk and controls taking place, and indeed, that might lead to the sort of examples that Andrew has mentioned, for contract extensions and all those sorts of things.
So thank you. One of the things we try and do now is look in much more depth. So we're getting a deeper level of assurance now than maybe has been in recent times. I think in relation to this specific one for the council feedback, it was about a technical issue and the auditor not understanding the technical aspects of that audit. It's not necessarily in our understanding where the question we ask is in around relation to normal understanding of risk and what those risks could transfer to across the council. This was very specific to a technical issue within a technical software delivery. I wouldn't ever expect my auditors to understand that level of detail, and that's a learning curve on both sides, so that we're clear in what we're asking and they understand what we're asking for, and it's not about that specific technical knowledge about one aspect of delivery.
But the greater depth is starting to take place.
It definitely is, yes. It sometimes finds itself where we're looking at a certain area of audit, and as we start to unpick what that looks like, we then slightly alter the scope to touch bases with other areas to see what that looks like as a result of the depth that we've done on the initial scoping document. And that's starting to go very well. And again, we've been supported across the council all the time that we've done that.
Thank you.
Claire, thank you much.
Following from Ian's second question, in the measured language that auditors use, a judgment that opens with "there are no established processes" is a pretty serious indictment. Now, congratulations to the internal audit team for having ferreted these out, found them, reported them, and secured buy-in from management. Great. But my question to Andrew is, have you got any other areas where there are no established control processes? And how do you know whether you have or haven't?
Yeah, so I think that wording, I think I guess it's a consistent process. Maybe I would have worded it, because there's a process in resources, but it's not the same process that there is in place, I guess, by an example for this one. Yeah, I think that's why I've got the team are there to do this good work, aren't they? So we know what we know, don't we? And that's why, an appropriately resourced team with good skilled individuals like Claire and Sarah are why they're here, really, to find those issues where, yeah.
If I may follow up, Chair, is that a stage too far? Is calling in internal audit to a deep dive and find every nasty under every stone, is that the second stage of alertness and risk awareness? Have you got sufficient risk awareness, control awareness in operational managers at all the appropriate levels, such that internal audit never finds a situation of there being a significant absence of processes? Internal audit will always find improvements to processes, because that's what they're programmed to do, but have you got to enhance alertness and awareness and suspicion, if you like, and scepticism in the operational managers at several levels?
It's a fair point. I think one of the things that we've been talking about, I know particularly my directorate recently, particularly through some of the management step back sessions we have, all of those sort of things around the concept of professional curiosity and challenging the established norms. So yeah, does that happen across the council? I think that'd be for the different directors to be able to say what happens in their areas, but it's certainly something that we are starting to encourage more and would continue to encourage more. You know, I think it's that old classic, isn't it? The most dangerous phrase is we've always done it that way, isn't it? And you know, I think through things like staff turnover, new leadership, etc., in different areas, as we've had both in the legal and the commercial areas, as an example for this one, has been a helpful time to have that challenge come from the team. So, but yeah, there's probably something to develop on there, but that'd be my answer.
I think just to add to that, as you say, we are very precise in the wording that we use, and to say there are no established processes is not the same as that there are no processes. If there were no processes, we probably wouldn't have given it a limited assurance. But where we have established process, it's about that consistency and the adequacy of processes that are in place. So it is only a small nuance, but from an audit perspective, there is a significant difference between no processes and no established processes. Hopefully that helps.
The one thing I'd also say when it comes to looking for assurance, for me, is the risks. You've got two sources. One is the case of, right, what has been going wrong and how well we're spotting this and detecting it, and the controls and how effective they are. Are they there? Are they working? The other one is what potentially could go wrong and hasn't yet, which is usually more dangerous because those are the ones that come out of the left field. And I think the thing for me would be to, when we're looking at this, and Andrew, just to continue that curiosity thing, is with new management is an opportunity to do this. And are we comfortable that's being fed back into literally the report we've just had around the risk and the combined risk review that we've been having a look at? It is a constant process, and the answer for me is actually I can't predict the second group. I can absolutely get MI on the first group, which is the what is going wrong, and can we understand the magnitude of the risk that might blow up, as opposed to, because we're getting some tells. What we're not saying is we're not managing to thread that through to get I understand the magnitude of the risk. So I think when we're having a look, it's back to that same review. It's back to also the other one, we've got the nil assurance on there as well. Excuse me. It's that bit of, do you understand that's your day job? Is part of the managing of the risk of that area around the business. And I think that's the bit that we start to see. We start seeing proxies for. So again, we just keep an eye on it, but that's the bit for me.
So just for some reassurance, on that contracts one, we didn't find anything that's going drastically wrong. It's about systems and processes. So some of our systems and processes in this area run on the goodness of the staff we've got, as opposed to anything's wrong and it's all falling apart. As you will understand, from a risk and an audit perspective, it's if the people change, could our risk profile change? And if you were to look at the report, you would see the risks are associated, what could potentially happen. If that, again, gives a little bit of assurance.
Okay. Questions? Thank you, Claire. I think that's very clear. And thank you for your assurances on that point. Obviously, Ian makes some salient points there we need to ask. So thank you again, and thank you to Andrew. Any further questions? No. Paul.
Yeah, so I've got the same sort of fascination that was looking at these bar charts, and I'm looking at feedback on district clients, and there's like 4 bits of fare. Now, I wouldn't expect you to tell me, but based on parental analysis, and 80% of the problems are down to 20% cause, really, what's the distribution of only fare? Because we're looking at value added to service, we're looking at closure meetings, and we're looking at updated on audit observations, and we're looking at knowledge of risk and controls. All of these items I would be concerned about. Thank you.
So even though this is the internal audit report for LCC, we do capture feedback for our district clients as well. And so this is specifically for our district team, and it's client feedback, so they're external to the council. This feedback, so the analysis was completed by the audit manager for the district team, and this was actually from one specific audit where the root cause of that feedback was better communications were required, and so that was taken by the audit manager to then improve the communications during the audit process. So there shouldn't just be communication at the beginning and the end, and we do do training within our team to make sure that that's the case. And this feedback was just to make sure that clients were continually updated about the observations, that they were aware of the audit process and how it was progressing as it went along. So it was the same audit, but better communications was the ultimate feedback.
Thank you. So I think Mark just muttered in my ear, but this is the feedbacks. Do you find them, Sarah? They are I want to say a worthwhile process, but they give you a good insight into your work with both within LCC and outside it.
Since we've moved to a more quality-based approach in our feedback, it has enabled the management team across both LCC, schools and districts to inform what we then take away from that feedback to ensure the quality of our audits is high. So since we've moved to, it's more questions that we ask of our clients, but they're all quality-based. Or they're aligned to our standards. So it gives that assurance that we're delivering high quality audits, and also that our audits are aligned to the audit standards.
Thank you, Chair. So the report aims to share the progress and work undertaken by the committee across the 2024 calendar year. The main source documents for this have been the Constitution to share the functions and responsibilities of the committee along with the committee minutes. Previously, there's been a draft report presented in September and then a revised report presented once the year's concluded. This year, I've just done one shared version with Chairman's support, which holds all the information for the calendar year as it's presented. The report is authored to provide a focus on the challenge and scrutiny of risk offered through the committee and includes a look forward with some of the changes at this time that we're expecting for 2025. It also includes the audited annual accounts report for 23-24 from the external auditors, which has been shared with members. Big thank you for me to the Chair for the involvement in the production of the report, and as always, happy to take any questions from the floor at all.
It's a real pedantic one on the table. Really sorry, it's just the fact that you got 67% for one and 68% on the other for the same amount of attendance. I don't know if it was a longer meeting, but it may have felt like it at the time.
I have no words.
Further question on this matter? I think we can conclude because that will go to full council, of course. So that's fine. Thank you once again for all your assistance on. Right, could we have so the recommendation is that we approve the annual report that we've just discussed. So proposed, seconded, all those in favour? Thank you. There we go, Thomas. Thank you. So to move on now to our final agenda item, which is the committee's work plan.
Thank you. So the work plan shows the planning for the remainder of this year. The meeting in March will share the indicative fraud and audit plans for approval for 25-26. That meeting will also include a review of the year from a counter-fraud perspective and from a risk perspective. KPMG will present their strategy for 24-25 audit, and there will be paper on the accounting policies and any resultant changes to keep the committee informed. There is a new standing item relating to the Constitution review work, which is being steered by Will Bell, the monitoring officer, as part of the responsibility for this committee is to recommend any changes. So we'll come to the meeting to present any work that's been done up to date on that. And the work programme will be updated for 25-26 and shared with the new chair in due course. Again, happy to take any questions.
I think it's all quite self-explanatory. It takes us to the end of this term. Okay, thank you.
To a certain extent, I think this was brought up at the pre-meeting, and that's to try and get training as early as possible into the new committee, because I think that would be useful, bearing in mind there might be quite significant changes to the committee as well.
If the elections go ahead, that's the plan. So it's it's all to be sort of front-loaded, and we've got a programme that we're developing to help the committee, and possibly some suggestions that may come from some consultancy work that's been, some consultation work that's been happening with some of the larger external agencies as well. So we'll bring some of that information as well, but we will provide that training.
The last public interest report that you circulated was quite an interesting read. So that would be a good topic just to bring up as a what not to do lesson. Yes.